You've said it maybe out loud to another owner in a group chat, at a conference, maybe just in your own head on a Sunday night when you're already dreading Monday. No one wants to work anymore. And the moment you said it or heard it, something released because the problem is them. You don't have to change anything. You just have to survive. And here's what I want you to know before we go any further. That phrase isn't wisdom. It isn't clarity. It isn't you finally seeing the truth about the industry. It's the most expensive belief in the beauty business. And by the end of this episode, you're going to understand exactly why and exactly what becomes possible the moment you put it down.
Yeah, so welcome to Salon Success Secrets. I'm Jen. And what Lindsay just said is exactly what this episode is about. We are going to take that phrase totally apart today. No one wants to work anymore. We are going to show you where it actually comes from and what it's actually costing you. And most importantly, what becomes possible the moment that you let it go. Because we've watched salon owners transform their teams, like their culture, their results, not by finding better people, but by becoming a different kind of leader. And that shift starts with understanding what is really happening. When someone says, no one wants to work, so let's get into it.
Yeah. And here's what I want you to hear underneath that phrase no one wants to work. It sounds like an observation about the market. It sounds like something that's happening out there to you beyond your control. But here's the thing about that phrase that nobody talks about it's a protection strategy. It protects you from asking a harder, more honest question. And the harder question is this: have I actually built something worth working for? It is so much easier to blame the people than to look at the environment. It is so much easier to say nobody wants to work than to make the identity shift from being a service provider who owns a salon and being an actual salon owner. And that shift, that identity shift, is the entire conversation we're having today. Now, stay with us. We're not here to make you feel bad. I've been in hard seasons. I know Jen has. I know what it feels like to pour into someone and watch them walk out. I know what it feels like to invest time, energy, trust, and feel like it disappeared. I know the exhaustion that takes you to that place. But here's the most important thing I can tell you: every retention problem, every performance problem, every I just can't find good people problem, when you look at it through this lens, it stops being a people problem and it becomes a leadership problem with a leadership solution. That is the good news, because leadership is something you can change. The people out there, you don't control them, but the leader you are being right now, that is entirely yours. So no one wants to work is not an observation about your team. It's a confession about your leadership. And once you see it that way, you can't unsee it.
So I want to share or tell you a story because this didn't happen to some careless leader. It actually happened to me. And I want to be transparent about it because I think it is the version of this problem that that flies the most under the radar. I've had a service provider on my team who had something special. The ones I'm talking about. You look at them and you can see a version of themselves that they haven't even fully stepped into yet. They're talented. They cared about our guests. They genuinely wanted to be there. And then you notice that they start getting inconsistent. They're late sometimes, a little flat in their energy. They're not bringing the same presence. They're not crushing it in the way that they can. And this person was actually a girl, and so when this happened, I genuinely believed that I was being a good leader. I gave her space. I lightened the expectations. I told myself I was meeting her where she was. I told myself that I was being gracious. But what I was actually doing, I was managing around the problem instead of leading through it. I was avoiding the real conversation because real conversations are uncomfortable. And I told myself that discomfort was the same as unkindness, but it is not. Discomfort is what growth feels like. And my job as her leader was not to protect her from discomfort. My job was to call her into something bigger. One day, I'll never forget this. I finally stopped waiting for the right moment, which, by the way, never comes. And I sat down and I had an actual conversation, not the check-in version, not the, how you doing today version, the real one. And I said to her, I said, I see what you're capable of. I see you holding back. And I need more from you because I know you have it. It's in there. And it was so beautiful because she cried. And then she said something I will never forget. She said, I've been waiting for someone to believe in me and say it out loud, not in your heart, not in your hopes, out loud. I've been believing in her silently for months, and silence cannot develop a person. She needed someone to hold her to what she was actually capable of. And I had been withholding that from her, calling it patience. Almost let her drift out the door because I confused avoidance with grace. And that is the quiet version of giving up on people, not the loud, cynical version, just the soft, well intentional version. And it produces the same result: a person who needed real leadership getting managed at instead of led forward.
Yeah. Okay. So I need you to stay with me for this next part because what I'm about to say is the thing that changes how you see everything else. Jen, that was such a beautiful story. And, this is truly the intellectual foundation underneath every team problem you have ever had. Write this down. There are actually two kinds of people who own salons. There's service providers who happen to own a salon and salon owners. They are not the same identity. They do not ask the same questions. They do not build the same businesses. And when something goes wrong, they do not arrive at the same diagnosis of the problem. A service provider owner, they bought a salon or they built one, but they never actually stopped being a service provider. They're still operating from the identity of someone whose job is to do hair or skin or nails. So they measure their success by their own chair, their own clientele, like their own schedule. And so a good week means they personally had a good week behind the chair. Maybe some other people did too, but since they don't see that they're benefiting from it, it doesn't matter as much to them. But a salon owner's job is something entirely different. A salon owner's job is to build something, to create the environment, the systems, the culture, the career map, so that every single person in that building has what they need to succeed. Their success is measured by what the whole team produces, by what the guests experience, by whether the salon runs beautifully with or without the owner standing in it. Now, here's where this gets important. When a service provider owner has team problems, think inconsistent performance, high turnover, stylists who don't want to stay, they diagnose it as a people problem, because they have the identity of someone who does hair or skin or nails. And when hair doesn't go well, you blame the person in the chair. And when a salon owner has the exact same problems, they diagnose it as a systems problem, a culture problem, a communication problem, a coaching problem, all of which are inside their control, all of which have solutions. Same team, same building, same city, but completely different diagnosis, and completely different outcomes, truly. No one wants to work is the diagnosis of a service provider owner. And a service provider owner cannot solve what a salon owner needs to build. And this is not judgment, this is a description because most salon owners were never taught how to be salon owners. They were taught how to do hair or skin. M- Maybe they were taught how to like pass their boards, or maybe they were taught how to get a booked schedule, but nobody taught them how to build a culture or how to create a career map or how to read the numbers and make decisions from them, or how to have the real conversations that change someone's trajectory, just like Jen talked about. And that is not a character flaw. That is a curriculum gap. And curriculum gaps, those are totally fixable.
Yeah, they sure are. So I want to show you something that is going to feel uncomfortably familiar because the reason no one wants to work is so sticky. The reason it is so hard to argue with once you believe it is that it eventually creates its own proof, right? So here is exactly how it happens. It starts with one disappointment, a team member who leaves without notice, or a service provider you believed in who doesn't perform, or an investment of time and energy that doesn't seem to land. That's step one. And that disappointment is real. The pain in that moment is completely legitimate. But here is where the path forks. In that moment, you have two choices. You can ask, what does my leadership, my onboarding, my systems need to look like? Or you can absorb the belief. These people just don't want to work. You see, most service provider owners, without even realizing it, take the second path. That's not because they are bad leaders, it's because nobody ever handed them the map to the first one. And once that belief takes root, here's what happens next. They stop casting the vision because what's the point if people won't follow? They pull back their investment in people before those people had the chance to prove themselves. Their next interview, like, it stops feeling like an invitation and starts feeling like an interrogation. So that's a good one. If you write that down, it stops feeling like an invitation and starts feeling like an interrogation. Their best candidates walk in, feel something heavy in the room, and choose the salon down the street, the one that still feels alive. And the owner looks at that empty chair and she calls it proof.
Mhm.
That is the mechanism. That is how one belief, left unchallenged, builds the exact evidence it predicted. And what's heartbreaking about this is the owner is not wrong that their people are disengaged. The people are disengaged, right? But the disengagement is the response to the environment, not the cause of it.
Mhm.
There is no onboarding that sets people up to win, or no career path that makes staying worth it, or no culture that tells a person what success looks like here and makes them want to reach for it. And when people have nothing to reach for, they go through the motions. And when they go through the motions, the owner points and says, see, I told you, nobody wants to work. It is a loop. And the only exit from that loop is the decision to become a different kind of owner.
Mm. So true. I want to take a moment to just defend every beauty professional who has ever been called lazy or unmotivated or entitled because, you know, I've been inside of the industry for a long time and I've seen what these people are actually made of. They went to school for their craft. They sat in someone else's chair for years. They've been building a clientele from what feels like nothing, through sheer relationship and skill. They stay late the night before a wedding, not because it's in their job description, but because they care. They remember client birthdays without being reminded. They hold space for people on truly the hardest days of their lives. And they still find a way to make them feel beautiful. So that is not a workforce that doesn't want to work. That is one of the most service oriented, emotionally invested, care driven workforces that exists. And so many of them, too many of them, were never properly developed. No real mentorship, no clear picture of what success looks like in that specific salon. No leader who said, Here's where we're going, and here's what it takes to get there. And I believe you have what it takes. So they float. They get inconsistent. They just start going through the motions. And the salon owner, they call it attitude. It's not attitude, it's truly the absence of a system. It's what happens when talented people are placed in an environment that was never designed to develop them. A service provider cannot build a career inside a salon that has never defined what a career looks like. That's not on the service provider, that is on the owner. And the moment an owner takes that on, not as a burden, but as the actual job, everything shifts. Because now the question is no longer, why won't they perform? The question is, what do I need to build so that the performance is the natural result? And that's a completely different question, and it truly leads somewhere completely different. You guys, the beauty industry does not have a work ethic problem, it has a leadership and development problem.
Yeah. So think of this. I want to paint you a picture. There's two salons, same zip code, same city, same economy. They're pulling from the exact pool of candidates, right? So imagine salon one. The owner is exhausted. They've hired people who seemed promising and watched them fizzle. They invested time, energy, and trust and felt more than once like it disappeared, right? They started to believe quietly and privately that the problem is just the people out there right now. Right. So onboarding starts to look like this. Here's your station. Here's are the apps we use. Here's your Wi-Fi password. Good luck. Right? There's no written culture, no career path anyone could point to, no scoreboard that makes success visible, no regular group coaching. Coaching only happens when something goes wrong. Ouch, right? Which means leadership only shows up in this salon feeling like a correction, not connection. And the team isn't disengaged because they don't want to work. The team is disengaged because no one ever told them what winning looks like here. No one showed them a path forward. Nobody said, I believe in what you're capable of, and here's how we're going to get you there. And so they just do enough, just enough, because just enough is all that's been asked of them.
Yeah, that is a vivid picture of Salon one, And now I want you to imagine Salon two. This owner hit the exact same wall. They've had hard seasons, they've lost people they believe in. They've felt every single thing that the owner in Salon one that Jen just described is feeling. But instead of diagnosing it as a people problem, they diagnosed it as a systems problem. So they built the onboarding, the real one, the one that tells a new team member exactly what success looks like. And this specific building from day one, they built the career path. So a stylist sees who walks in on their, so a stylist who they can see it when they walk in on their very first day, exactly where they're headed, what they need to produce to move to the next level, and what that level looks like financially. They built the scorecard so that everyone in the building knows what they're playing for. The wins get celebrated publicly, and the gaps get coached privately. But success is visible and growth is trackable. And so that just makes progress real. They built a culture with a standard, not just a vibe, not a random mission statement on the wall, but a living, breathing set of expectations that every person in the building understands. And it is held to with care. And now people who come in to interview at that salon, they drive home, they call their friends, and they're like, I don't know what it is about that place, but I want to work there. And they have a wait list of people who want to join their team. They keep their best people when the salon down the street can't hold on to anyone. Their guests don't just come back, they bring everyone they love. And the difference between those two salons is not the economy. It is not the generation that's entering the workforce. It is not luck or location or budget. It is the identity of the owner who built the thing. The owner one is a service provider who owns a salon. One owner is that service provider. Sorry. One owner is a service provider who owns a salon, and one owner is a salon owner. And those two people build completely different businesses with the exact same raw material.
So true. So let's talk about what the identity shift actually produces, because this is where it gets concrete, right? Salon owners build four things that service provider owners don't build. And these four things are what create the salons that we are just describing. The first thing salon owners build is a culture with a standard, not a vibe, you guys, not a feeling, not a hope, not on a prayer, but a real defined standard that every person in the building understands and is held to with love and consistency. That's the most important part. Held to with love and consistency. When the culture has a standard, you do not need to micromanage. The culture does the managing, the standard does the coaching, and people rise to meet what's expected of them when what's expected of them is actually clear. The second thing salon owners build is a career map. Not a vague promise that, hey, there's room to grow here. No, an actual visible map. A stylist or service provider who walks in on day one should be able to see exactly where they're headed, exactly what it takes to get there, and exactly what that destination looks like for their income, their craft, and their growth. People don't leave salons that give them a real reason to stay. And a career path is the most powerful reason to stay that any salon owner can offer. The third thing salon owners build is systems that set people up to win. Onboarding systems, consultation systems, pre-book systems, retail systems, not because they are controlling, because they care enough about their team's success to remove the guesswork. A system is not a cage. A system is a runway. And when people have a runway, they can fly. And the fourth thing salon owners build is a scoreboard. When your team sees the numbers, their numbers, the salon's numbers, the target, they can play to win. They can see their progress. They can feel the momentum. They know what a good week looks like before the week is over. People rise to the standard that you're willing to make visible. None of these four things require you to hire different people. Everybody say, whew, thank goodness, right? They just require you to become a different kind of owner. And that is the shift. And that shift, we actually teach it. We built it inside our own salons first. We've made the mistakes, found what worked, and now we spend our days passing it on.
Thank you. Yes. And I want to say something directly to you, the listener. If you have ever said, no one wants to work, I'm not here to shame you. I've been in hard seasons. I know what it feels like to lose someone you believe in. I know what it feels like to pour into people and wonder if any of it is even landing. But here's what I have learned, and here's what I want you to hear today. Every time I was struggling with my team, the answer was not out there. It was in here. And the gap between the leader I was being and the leader my team needed me to be. And that gap is not a personal failure. It's a signal. It's your business telling you it's time to grow into the next version of what you're supposed to be. And the next version is a salon owner, not a service provider who happens to own a salon owner. And here's what I need you to understand about that identity shift. It's not a rebranding. It's not a new set of habits. It's a decision about who you are and who you are responsible to. So when you decide you are a salon owner, you stop waiting for better people and you start building a better environment. When you decide you're a salon owner, you stop diagnosing everything as a people problem and you start asking what your leadership, your systems, your culture needs to look like. When you decide you're a salon owner, you walk into your building differently tomorrow morning. Not because everything changed overnight, but because you changed. And the people in your building will feel it before you even say a single word. Right now, I want you to make that decision. Not a goal, not a to do list item, a decision about your identity. Say this out loud if you need to. I'm not a service provider who owns a salon. I am a salon owner, and salon owners build things. Feel what shifts when you take that on, because it's not a small thing. It's a totally different set of questions, a different set of problems you are willing to own, a completely different business you are now capable of building. So when you walk into your salon tomorrow morning, you are not walking in as someone who is trying to survive their team. You are walking in as the person who built this, who is responsible for what it becomes, who has the power and the tools to make something worth showing up for, to make it that. That is not a burden. That is the whole point. Leadership is a gift. And the people in your building are waiting right now, whether they can articulate it or not, for you to step fully into it.
All right, you guys. So here is the bottom line. If your salon is struggling with retention, that is a systems and culture problem. If your team isn't performing, that is a career map and coaching problem. And if you cannot find good people, that is an environment and leadership energy problem. None of those are no one wants to work problems. All of them are salon owner problems with salon owner solutions. The salons that will define this industry over the next decade are the ones with the biggest budgets, are not the ones with the biggest budgets or the best Instagrams, right? Or the most expensive zip code. They are the ones led by people who made the identity shift, who decided in a moment like the one Lindsay just walked you through, that they were done being a service provider who owns a salon and started being an actual salon owner. That salon can be yours. That leader is already in you. And the only thing standing between you and that result is the work of actually building it. And that work, we actually teach it here, and you're always welcome to join us.
Yes. And, before we close, if this episode hit home for you, share it with a salon owner who needs to hear it. And if you're ready to go deeper, we wrote the book on this, Think and Get Rich as a Salon Owner. It's available now, and the link is in the show notes. Or if you want to work through this live with us, come to our next challenge. That link is in the show notes too.
All right. The future of this industry belongs to the salon owners who decided. So we'll see you next time on Salon Success Secrets.